congratulations for anybody that's still with me. That means you've listened to the introduction to venture capital. You've listened to a guide to terminology in venture capital and angel investing. You've listened to the structure and thesis of an angel investment portfolio or a venture fund. You've listened to venture capital and the economy. You've listened to deal sourcing, valuation, and due diligence, which was like 3 lectures in one. And we're now on lecture number 6, Tech Investing Fails. And this isn't actually to make fun of anybody that's had a failed investment or to somehow make it into a comedy, which some people do. We are all, if we do enough deals, we're going to have failed investments. That's the truth. And they're going to fail for all kinds of reasons. But the purpose of a post-mortem, and if you're a doctor like I was, you know the purpose of a post-mortem is not that when you do the post-mortem, then no more of your patients will die. You do the post-mortem to learn if there were any preventable errors that would have stopped the patient from dying. So we have these meetings where when there's an unexpected death, you actually, sometimes you even go to the morgue, you sit around the dead body, and the pathologist explains to you what happened, what was the cause of death, what led to this death. And then the consultant will come and say, okay, what can we learn from this situation? What are we not going to do again? What processes can we put in place to prevent this kind of death? So for this lecture, I'm your pathologist, and we'll be looking through a few famous failed investments and trying to find out what went wrong and how we as practitioners, as angel investors, as venture analysts, as venture capitalists, as partners can prevent this happening. So, the graveyard of postmortems, some of the biggest tech fails. Content. Why startups fail? We'll be looking at the startup failure rate. We'll be looking at some case studies of failed startups. And we'll be looking about how this affects our approach to investing and considering the impact of pivots as well. And then finally, we'll be looking at the very definition of failure and what failure really means. And if we can, how long in terms of time do we have before we define something as a failure? So this is Doctor Strange, and you know, I feel a certain kinship with Doctor Strange from the Marvel Avengers, because both of us started our lives off as doctors, and then we went on to do something else. So I started my life as a medical doctor, a clinician like Doctor Strange, and then I went into business, and now I work in finance. And Dr. Strange was a medical doctor in the hospital, also working in clinical medicine, and then he went on to save the world and become the master of time. So, you know, we both went on to do great things after clinical medicine. And his character in the Avengers can actually control to some extent time. So he can create these time portals and manipulate time and, you know, jump into parallel universes. And he was a neurosurgeon before, but he gained this power to do all of this fun stuff. But if you recall, when Thanos destroyed half of the people in the world and the Avengers were trying to figure a way out, he tried to look at all the different scenarios that could potentially happen in the future that would prevent 50% of the universe's population from being wiped out. But what he could not do, even as the master of time for the entire universe, was be able to tell you that this exact thing is going to happen in the future. So if the Doctor Strange cannot tell exactly what is going to happen in the future, then probably we as investors, no matter how much we look at startup failures, cannot tell you exactly or cannot tell exactly what is going to happen in the future. And that's why some of the startups that we invest in fail. And we'll be looking at some of the reasons why that happens. So in 1992, the CEO of Intel, Andy Grove, who people study to this day. So there are not only books like biographies of Andy Grove, but there have actually been books written about Andy Grove's management style. There are books on lessons from Andy Grove. Andy Grove quotes are some of the things that you read as an entrepreneur and are inspired by. Intel CEO Andy Grove there's no argument as to whether he was not a fantastic, admired, and rightly so, historical CEO that led one of the world's most innovative companies at the time. But in 1992, he made a prediction about mobile phones. And he said, the idea of a wireless personal communicator in every pocket is a pipe dream driven by greed. In 1992, the sharpest CEO in the world, or one of the sharpest CEOs in the world, one of the cleverest, one of the most innovative people, said that this mobile phone thing is impossible. That why would somebody want to be speaking on a phone and they'll keep it in their pocket and they'll be moving around like with it? That doesn't make sense. That the whole idea of it is driven by greed. Fast forward to 2022, we know what happens. It might be driven by greed, but we can't do without our phones. In fact, that's the first thing we check when we wake up. So even super sharp guys get predictions about the future wrong. This is another one, and this quote is from the Microsoft CEO, Steve Ballmer. And he said this at a conference. He was, one of the greatest CEOs of Microsoft. Again, a super smart guy. Microsoft is one of the most profitable and successful companies that has ever existed. So this is a guy that people listen to. And what he said is, there's absolutely no chance that the iPhone is going to get any significant share. No chance. And what he was complaining about was two things. Number one, nobody is going to buy a phone for $500. And number two, nobody is going to use a phone without a keyboard. That what makes you want to type? You need a keyboard. That you can't just use a phone with just a screen. That was what he was saying, that nobody is not going to catch on. I don't think anybody I know has a phone with a keyboard right now. And we all know what happened with the iPhone. In fact, everybody wanted iPhones. It became one of the most successful devices in history. Now, we're in the business of venture capital, which means that we're trying to predict what is going to be big in the future, and we're trying to put money behind it. But I've now said that super sharp guys, like the former Microsoft CEO, the former Intel CEO, even the master of time, Dr. Strange, could not see into the future. So how are we supposed to do it? And the saddest thing is, it's not even just about knowing the future. So the entity now known as HP actually beat Apple by 3 whole years to bring out a portable MP3 player. So we all saw when Apple launched the MP3 player, and he said, this is the only way that you can keep 100 or was it 1,000 songs in your pocket. Before that, you can remember what people were doing. It was Walkman, very bulky, very large, very ugly looking, or Discman, where you have to carry the CDs. So even if you want to listen to 20 different artists, you don't have to carry CDs. It was not a very big, ugly machine, right? And Steve Jobs held up this iPod and said, this is 1,000 songs in your pocket, and everybody clapped. Not knowing that HP, or the entity now known as HP, had made that product 3 years before. So it was not new. But the fact is, even though they were the first ones to invent it, and the first ones to bring it to market or try to bring it to market, if a venture capitalist had backed that idea, it would have still been a bad investment because they could not execute. They didn't have the marketing. They were fighting instead of bringing out the product. There were so many legal issues. They didn't have the right team, distribution. I think eventually it was sold to some Korean company that didn't even want to sell it outside Korea, and there was an argument over it, and then nobody could bring out the thing, and before you know it, somebody used this thing to make $1 billion right in front of their eyes. So this thing is about, even if you know the future, and you know that this thing is going to be big, there's another problem on top of that. So you do not even have to only be Dr. Strange and be able to see the future or what is going to be big in the future. You also have to be able to bet on the right team that can execute. And that is adding additional difficulty to it because knowing the future is hard enough. And that's probably why 90% of startups fail in America. In Nigeria, probably more than 90% of startups fail. And the number one reason why startups fail is because the founders have misread the market demand. That's almost the reason why almost 50% of startups fail, because you can spot a gap in the market, but there might not necessarily be a market in the gap. So for instance, in Nigeria today, let's say that, and it has worked in other places, so I won't say it's an impossible idea, but let's say I came up with an idea to sell air. So I got a team of 200 people, and I sent them into Lagos to be picking up all the empty ever bottled water, empty plastic bottles of ever water. And then I told them to fill it with air. So just go to somewhere that is windy and fill the bottles with air and close it. And then the founder comes to me with this idea of bottles full of air that have been picked from the ground of Lagos. And he says, nobody's doing this. And I'm going to sell each bottle for 500,000 naira. Nobody's doing the idea, so there's definitely a gap in the market. And you know that there are advantages to that business in that it makes Lagos State clean. It's employing hundreds of people. People that wouldn't have been employed in Lagos State before. He's employing them, cleaning up the state, and now he is pitching to you that he's going to sell each bottle of this air for 500,000 naira. That's about, what, $1,000. Fantastic. Nobody is doing it. There's definitely a gap in the market. But is there a market in the gap? How many people can he get to pay 500,000 naira or $1,000 for a bottle of air? So a lot of people have fantastic ideas, sometimes even impactful ideas, but the number one reason that they fail, according to CB Insights, is because of a lack of market demand. So when we're assessing ideas in the venture capital world, we have to really, really think carefully about the demand for particular products and what is the actual demand. There are 200 million people in Nigeria, but does that mean that all of them can buy iPhone? Does that mean that there's a big market for iPhone in Nigeria? Apple has not opened a shop here. If they knew that there were at least half of those people could afford iPhones, I'm sure that they would have come to Nigeria and opened a shop. And one of the things that we have to do in our due diligence is really assess the total addressable market. People that are able and willing to buy this product, because that's the biggest source of failure. So Jawbone was an interesting company, raised almost $1 billion. And if anybody remembers these devices, actually they were quite cool. They were, I think, one of the first sets of these monitoring devices that tell you your heartbeat, that tell you how much exercise you're doing in a day, that came out. So fascinating product. But it became the second costliest VC VC-backed failure of all time. After raising $1 billion, the company still failed and had to start selling off its assets. And I think it was because of misreading the demand for this particular product and perhaps not bringing out other alternative products quickly enough that had market demand. So I think that this actually probably, maybe some internal issues as well, but probably also a bit to do with market demand. And I think on our mobile phones, the phone started being able to record some of those exercise metrics anyway. So the device became an app, which also didn't help. And then there was Digg. I don't know if anybody remembers Digg. I think it crossed my consciousness. They raised $40 million and they were a social network like Facebook, like Twitter, like Instagram. And I honestly can't explain what happened to Digg. Because a few years ago, I would have said that no more social networks can come out. We have enough social networks and that space is filled. But TikTok that came out now, people are still on TikTok, people are still on Snapchat. But this Digg, somehow, after raising $44 million, it just really didn't perform. And at the time, Facebook and Twitter were booming, LinkedIn was going well, MySpace at that time was doing well as well, according to what Mike Phillips said at the time, who was an industry expert. But Digg just went into a tailspin and never recovered. And they had high-level venture capitalists. I mean, Greylock Partners is one of the high-level sort of tier one venture capitalists in America, and it just didn't work. Theranos is probably the most famous venture capital, should I even call it venture capital, or technology startup that has failed. And this is Elizabeth Holmes, the lady who was one of the most senior leaders and the most famous face at Theranos. And Elizabeth had a fantastic story. She dropped out of Stanford to found Theranos in 2003. And what her device was supposed to do was, really, really amazing. It was faster, cheaper, more accurate blood testing. So, when you go to the hospital and you have ordinary malaria, and just to run your full blood count and UNEs and malaria test, they have to take like half a liter of your blood or something. She actually claimed that she had a device that they would just prick your thumb, and with one drop of blood, they could do all the tests. So, people put money behind her. She raised $500 million. And to put $500 million into the Nigerian context, just to show you how much she raised, she probably raised the profit after tax of our biggest bank. So she raised a whole lot of money for this startup. If Zenith Bank PAT is 250 billion, she raised the PAT of Zenith Bank in a year. So all the money that they say they're debiting from you, add everything together, plus the money from the loans, plus everything. This lady raised that money. Like I said in the earlier lecture, the device didn't work. Not that the device had problems, or it did not work at all. Like, it seemed like it was a complete scam. There was no device. But because the people who were backing her obviously were not scientists, they didn't have that subject matter expertise, so she'll just take them to her lab, she'll show them around, she'll show them the machine. They don't really know how that machine works, but somehow she had some hype around her. Somehow she was able to raise the money. But apparently, even the documents that she was showing the investors in terms of the company revenues were false. Now let's go back to the lecture of due diligence. What are you supposed to check? Audited accounts is actually pretty basic. If you have a big four company saying that this company earned this amount, then you have the audited accounts to prove that that company earned that amount, and that means that they've checked it with the actual inflows into the account. But from the stories that I've heard, she just told them that the company was making $100 million. And it seemed Like there was no due diligence, or maybe one person thought that the other person had done due diligence, but it seemed at no point was a Big Four audit firm called to even validate the transaction before they handed over that quantum of money. So I don't really know the in-depth story of what happened, but even like our small startups that were only giving like a relatively small amount of money, we still call an external auditor to just make sure, I mean, as humble as we are, we're not giving away billions, but in a small way, just ensure that, okay, what is said on the balance sheet is correct if we don't understand the auditors. Even if the auditors, even if they have their own auditors, as far as we don't recognize the name of the auditors, we still try and give it to at least, even if we don't go to KPMG or PwC, we'll go to a Nigerian audit firm of note that cannot just fabricate and, you know, just make sure that we get a second opinion. But somehow, I don't know, in Cedar Climbs, in the whole big America, this lady collected $500 million from investors for a machine that, like I said, it was not faulty. It did not work at all. So this actually is a learning point around, you don't have to know the future to be able to do due diligence. You don't need to know the future to be able to just collect standard company documents. You don't need to know the future to be able to put certain things in place in terms of procedures and checklists to make sure you're not failing on the basics. And you definitely don't need to be Dr. Strange to be able to just ask KPMG for a second opinion. So, but interestingly enough, a lot of startups come to you with an idea, but that's actually not the business that they end up doing. So this is another complex thing about startup investing, that they might come to you with an idea that isn't great, and you don't invest. And then later they pivot to an idea that is actually great, that you would have invested in if they came to you with that idea in the first place, but by then it's too late because the valuation has gone up. And I mean, Samsung is one of the most famous technology companies in the world, but they started off as a fish company, selling frozen fish and dried fish. So if somebody came to you and said, oh, you know, we're selling frozen fish and dried fish, like that's not an exciting business to invest in. It was nothing to do with phone at that time. So I think even when you're rejecting ideas from founders, reject in a polite way that you can always go back to them if they change into something fantastic. Because they do make pivots along the way and they change the business that they're doing. So, why startups fail? Number 1, ran out of cash. Number 2, no market need. Number 3, got out competed. Number 4, flawed business model. Number 5, regulatory challenges. And when we're thinking about going through the due diligence process and the deal sourcing process, we should be thinking about all of these things and keeping them at the top of mind. And then also when we're doing portfolio management after we've invested, we should be trying to avoid all of these problems. But you know, I started off by saying how venture capital is a business of investing in things that will become big in the future. And then I've depressed you by telling you that even Dr. Strange, the master of time, does not know the future. Even Andy Grove and Steve Ballmer, arguably some of the best CEOs and the best business people in the world, could not tell the future. And I've even confused you further by saying even if you know the future and you know something is going to be big, sometimes companies just can't execute the future, even if they know something is going to be big. Somebody can come in 5 years' time and still do better than them because they have a better team. And that's why looking at the team is important. Then I even went on further to confuse you again, that even somebody can come to you with an idea and you can reject the idea because it's a bad idea, and then they can then pivot to a good idea. So you've missed the transaction because they came to you with an idea that was not the idea that they eventually did. And I'm going to continue to confuse you. The only thing that I can say is this is the last bit of confusion before we move on to the next topic. So in the next topic, we'll be talking about cryptocurrencies and central bank digital currencies. And Bitcoin was created by Satoshi Nakamoto. Nobody knows if it's a he, she, them. But Satoshi Nakamoto, when he created Bitcoin, actually learned a lot from failed digital currency products. Like, there were so many before him. I can only remember the name of one. It was eCash. But there were so many people that tried to create an eCash or an internet cash or a digital cash before him. And he went and read through all of those things and then kind of brought them all together. But if all of those companies had not failed, then there would be no Bitcoin. And even the very technology that he used to run the Bitcoin is called blockchain. And blockchain was actually invented way before, in the 90s, for contracts. Almost a decade, if I'm calculating correctly, before Satoshi Nakamoto invented Bitcoin. But at the time, it would have seemed like blockchain technology was a failure because there was no use case. Nobody eventually used it for contracting. So wouldn't you have called that a failure? But it's that same blockchain that Satoshi Nakamoto now picked up, a so-called failed product. And it's now the basis for a $1 trillion industry. It's just interesting how we think about failure and how we take bets on people and what considerations we have to make when we're taking bets on these early stage companies. But since we finished on blockchain and cryptocurrency, we're now going into a specialized course on cryptocurrency and blockchain and central bank digital currencies. So first of all, how did we get here? We started with an introduction to angel investing and venture capital, and then went on to a guide to the terminology that is commonly used in venture capital and angel investing. We then went on to the structure and thesis of either your angel investing portfolio or your venture capital fund. We then went on to talk about venture capital and the economy. Three very important topics in Lecture 5, deal sourcing, valuation, and due diligence. And then we kind of spoke about how to do what we're supposed to be doing, right? Building the future and predicting what's going to be big in the future and backing the innovators of the future, and how nuanced that can be, how difficult that can be, and how we even define failure and whether you need a lot of failures to get success anyway. And now we're going on to probably, the most in vogue and on trend part of the course, cryptocurrency, blockchain, central bank digital currencies, and the future of money.